In this week's feature segment, the recovery from the oil spill will continue for many years on the Gulf Coast. Farm Week's Amy Taylor is here to fill us in today on some of the efforts.
After months of cleanup, the Gulf Coast is creeping slowly toward recovery. There are questions about the long-term impact on wildlife. Biology researchers and students from Mississippi and Georgia are conducting a project to determine any secondary effects of the oil on seaside sparrows. In addition, Mississippi State University's Sea Grant Program and Extension Service are educating the seafood industry about recognizing oil contamination. The Mississippi Gulf Coast continues to fight back after facing crippling impacts of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Local businesses remain intact, seafood is heavily monitored, and there's no sign of oil in the water or on the beaches. Various assessments will determine the obvious immediate effects, such as economic damage and the loss of birds and marine life. But there could be results involving the spill that were not as visible or sudden. Dr. Mark Woodry, Senior Research Associate at the Mississippi State University Coastal Research and Extension Center, says a project is underway to explore possible long-term effects on marsh birds.
This is really one of the first efforts to really look at the effects of oil on marsh birds in general. There have been some studies that have looked at things like crabs, oysters, things like that, but nothing to really look at birds. What we're particularly interested in, and one of the things that's important in this oil spill, is that a lot of these oils that get into the marshes, it may not be real obvious amounts of oil, but when the oil breaks down, it can get into the environment. It can survive. It can be around in the environment for quite a long time. So we're really interested in trying to look at more long-term, so 5-10 years from now, are we still seeing any impacts, or are there even any impacts?
Oddly enough, the project on seaside sparrows was already in place before the oil spill. Anna Joy Lemke, graduate student in the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at University of Georgia, is working with Dr. Woodry and others on the research. Lemke talks about how the project evolved.
Started out just looking at basic life history and ecology of seaside sparrows, because they're a really common species in the marsh, but they haven't been studied at all on the Gulf Coast. So we just kind of wanted to figure out basic things like their survival rate, how many eggs they lay, how many young they produce, how big their territories are. Obviously, it's going to be impacted by this oil spill that clearly wasn't part of my initial research because it started beforehand, but now we have an opportunity to look at these parameters before the spill and then compare them after the spill, and hopefully, if there is an effect, we'd hopefully be able to see it.
Because the sparrows live in marshes and not on beaches, they are expected to experience secondary effects from the oil spill. For example, a sparrow might consume oil by eating seed with oil residue on it, as opposed to a beach bird that has been covered in oil. Dr. Woodry describes some ideas about what the long-term impact might be for these seaside sparrows.
They might show a decrease in their reproductive output, number of eggs that they lay, the number of young that they produce, things like that.
Lots of work goes into studying this information. The day starts before the break of dawn to begin trapping sparrows. The birds are gathered in what looks like large hairnets set up in the marshes. Then each one is given an identification band in case the bird happens to be captured again in the future. Lemke describes the type of information recorded for the project.
We measure the size of their wings, their mass, the size of their bills, and these can all be indicators of general health, because in general, a bigger, heavier bird is going to be healthier. And we're also looking at breeding things. We follow females and we find the nests. We count how many eggs are in the nest. We record whether the nest was predated or flooded, or if it successfully hatched and fledged young.
The term predated refers to whether the nest was damaged by predators, and fledged means the birds hatched and left the nest. Dr. Bob Cooper, professor in the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at University of Georgia, describes what can be taken from blood samples.
By taking blood samples, we can assess the general health of the bird. So, for example, by looking at red blood cells, we can get an idea of any kind of blood parasites that the bird might have.
White blood cells are also measured to determine stress levels. This is done by spreading out the blood sample on the slide so it can be tested for a cell count. A bird's encounter with oil raises its stress level, causing an increased number of white blood cells. The sparrows are also tested for other elements such as mercury, which may or may not be related to traces of oil if it's found in their systems. This This research will be important in understanding how the birds have been affected if they indeed came in contact with oil from the spill. In addition to this project, ensuring seafood safety has been heavily emphasized. Safe seafood assurance workshops have been held to train those in the industry on how to detect tainted or spoiled seafood. Dave Burridge, Marine Resources Professor at MSU Coastal Research and Extension Center, talks about who was responsible for starting the program.
All of the land-grant universities in the Gulf of Mexico decided to combine forces, expertise, and resources in putting together a program that would use our cooperative extension services, our sea grant programs, to help in the recovery process.
Participants were thoroughly trained on how to recognize odors in tainted seafood. They started off easy, being introduced to smells like fresh air and melon, then worked up to smelling items such as wet cardboard. Burridge says the workshop was extremely helpful, though not necessarily pleasant.
We got into what a spoiled product will start to smell like, and then you start getting things like cheesy, fruity, an iodine smell, and right on up to the very last one we hit them with before we let them loose on the oil was putrid. And believe me, if we'd have known, we might have wanted to schedule this program for after lunch instead of before lunch.
Burridge explains another benefit of completing the training, which took place at the MSU Coastal Research and Extension Center in Biloxi.
The participants in this workshop will get a certificate from the American Association of Food and Drug Officials, which that's a big deal. That's like having USDA Prime.
The certification allows participants to use the training in several facets of the seafood industry, such as marketing, food processing, and business management. Following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, there are more questions than answers about its impact on wildlife and how much time it will take to revive the economy and seafood industry. But hopefully, educating the industry and conducting research will give us a better idea of what lies in the horizon for the Gulf Coast. I'm Amy Taylor reporting. You can watch this story again on our Farm Week website at farmweek.msucares.com. We'll also have contact information for the Mississippi State University Coastal Research and Extension Center on Pops Ferry Road in Biloxi.